Fillmore Hancock is recalling that his grandmother, who was also a child, was given to a young white girl when she was only 1. So when we listen to formerly enslaved people, they say these things. They talked about this kind of lifelong process of socialization by which white girls came to understand themselves as markedly different than enslaved people, and the rituals that drove this point home for the enslaved and the free alike.
Hello, welcome to Cambridge Forum in Harvard Square, and thanks for joining us on this fine April evening to discuss our ever-evolving history, in particular as it alludes to the legacy of slavery. Thanks to the wonders of technology, which have revolutionized research methods, just think of the impact that DNA searches have had on tracing our ancestry, plus the enormous contributions of women historians and scholars of different ethnicities and backgrounds. We are now able to paint a much fresher, more authentic picture and more radical picture of the past, beyond the narrow, skewed white man's history. I'm Mary Stack, Director of Cambridge Forum, and tonight it is the turn of women to come under our scrutiny. In the book, They Were Her Property, we are going to examine the role that white women played as slave owners in the American South. According to tonight's guest speaker, Professor Stephanie Jones-Rogers, historian and author from UC Berkeley, it is now estimated that 40% of slave owners may have been white women. Most Americans know that George Washington owned enslaved people at his Mount Vernon home. Fewer know that his wife, Martha, dramatically increased the number of their slaves. When they wed in 1759, George owned 18 people, while Martha, one of the richest women in Virginia, owned 84. Contrary to the Gone with the Wind romanticism we have been sold in Hollywood, many of these women were fiercely active participants in the slave market and constituted a major economic force. They also fought to maintain the wealth and free labor that slavery provided them throughout the Civil War. Yet, as Jones-Rogers argues in her book, it was not only white women's ideological and sentimental connections to slavery that made them defend it. Scarlett O'Hara would have been protecting her financial assets, too. Tonight's moderator will be Tim Weiskell, African historian and social anthropologist, who is currently digitizing maps of the slave trade. But to tell us more about the hidden history of white women slave owners in the American South, we're very pleased to welcome someone who spent 10 years researching the topic, Professor Stephanie E. Jones-Rogers.
So let's start with this handsome young fella. This is James Redpath. And in 1859, after touring the antebellum South, the journalist and New York Tribune editor attempted to explain for his readers why white Southern women opposed emancipation. He believed that their sentiments were tied to a lifetime of indoctrination, reared as they were under the shadow of the peculiar institution. Slavery was incessantly praised and defended, he argued, virtually everywhere they went, by everyone they knew, and in most of the publications they read. Their consciences, thus early perverted, were never afterwards appealed to, with the result that they saw no reason to change their views. Redpath assumed that white Southern women did not know Negro slavery as it is because their society shielded them from the institution's horrific realities. Insulated by Southern patriarchs, white women seldom saw slavery's most obnoxious features. They never attend slave auctions, never witness examinations, and seldom, if ever, see the Negroes lashed, he said. More profoundly, they didn't know that the interstate slave trade in slaves was a, quote, gigantic commerce, end quote. Southern men revealed only the South Side view of slavery, Redpath argued. And if the women of the South knew slavery as it is, he was convinced they would join in the protests against it. Redpath's assumptions represented a commonly held patriarchal view. Yet narrative sources, legal and financial documents, and military and government correspondence make it clear that white Southern women knew the most obnoxious features of slavery all too well. Slave-owning women not only witnessed the most brutal features of slavery, they took part in them, they profited from them, and defended them. Let's see, did I go backwards? I went backwards. Okay, there we go. Okay, so after hearing what Redpath had to say, and after I read Redpath's Roving Editor, which was the book where these excerpts were taken, I immediately began to think about this particular kind of image of a slave auction. Here you see many men, white men, gathered around enslaved people, seeking to interrogate them, to find out about their skills, what they brought to the table, so to speak, as laborers. But what's obviously missing to me are the women. There are no women at this auction. And so from James Redpath's kind of imagining, his conceptualization of slavery and women's relationship to it, or really the lack thereof, you get this impression that women weren't invested in the economy of American slavery, that they may have, in fact, been ideologically invested, they may have indirectly benefited from the labor of enslaved people that were owned by the men in their lives, but rarely, if ever, do we think about, and Redpath clearly didn't think either, about the ways in which white women were directly invested in the economy of American slavery, meaning that they bought and sold enslaved people, they hired them, and they received their wages and pocketed those wages in order to benefit their families and their own well-being. And so for me, this is kind of the image that comes to mind when hearing about kind of Redpath's tour through the South. Another kind of image that I think comes to mind reading Redpath's conceptualization or description of white women's relationships to slavery is this indirect way that they were connected to, or rather disconnected from, the horrors of slavery, the ways in which these traumas that were enacted in the slave market. What you see here is an enslaved child being separated from their mother, and you see people onlooking, and in the back, hopefully in the yellow box, you can see a white woman and a white child. There, but not connected to the scene. There, but passively observing the scene. And for Redpath and many historians before this, this would ring true. This would be the kind of more accurate idea or conceptualization of white women's connections to the horrors of slavery. They were, in fact, disconnected. But when you listen to, and what I did was I said, okay, well, what happens if we listen to those individuals who would be most easily, most capable of telling us what life was like in slavery as an individual owned by a woman? What if we listened to what they had to say? What if we listened to what formerly enslaved people had to say? And when I began to listen to what formerly enslaved people had to say, they made it clear that white Southern women's economic relationships to slavery didn't begin in adulthood. It began in childhood, and in some cases during infancy. And so what you see in this image, for those of you who can see the image, this is also being recorded, so there are certain people that may not be able to see the image, is an enslaved woman with two young white children, one identifiably female white child. And so formerly enslaved people, when you listen to what they have to say about the women's kind of deep investments in the economy of slavery, is that those investments, those relationships began at these very early ages, even in infancy. They talk about enslaved people who were given to young white girls, sometimes even infants, when they were in childhood. So, for example, Fillmore Hancock told his interviewer in the 1930s, these federal employees who were put to work by the federal government during the Great Depression, who interviewed formerly enslaved people to find out what they had to say about their experiences in slavery. One of them asked Fillmore Hancock about his experience in slavery, and so he talked about his grandmother, and he told his interviewer that his grandmother was given to Mrs. as her own on the day his grandmother was born. Remarkably, Hancock recalled that old Mrs. was only a year old when that happened. So Fillmore Hancock is recalling that his grandmother, who was also a child, was given to a young white girl when she was only 1. So when we listen to formerly enslaved people, they say these things. They talked about this kind of lifelong process of socialization by which white girls came to understand themselves as markedly different than enslaved people, and the rituals that drove this point home for the enslaved and the free alike. White slave-owning girls also made it clear that they had the power to claim other human beings as their property when they selected specific enslaved people to serve them. When Betty Coffer, for example, was born, her master's daughter Ella was only a little girl, but she nevertheless claimed Coffer as her own. Shortly after Betty was born, they played together and they grew up together, according to Betty. And eventually, Betty Coffer became Ella's personal servant, waiting on her, standing behind her chair during dinner, and sleeping beside her on the bedroom floor. But more profoundly, formerly enslaved people tell us that this process of socialization was effective. White girls often made claims of ownership in their conversations with enslaved people. A formerly enslaved woman named Melinda recalled that her young mistress would frequently tell her, "When I get big and get married to a prince, you gonna come with me and tend to all my chillins." And when her mistress married Honor Dufour, she took Melinda with her as part of their new household. As Southern girls, young white women thought about how enslaved people would fit into their lives, not just as playmates or companions, but as property. And when they were old enough, they turned their imaginings into reality. Formerly enslaved people also remarked upon how this process of socialization also involved lessons about slave management and discipline, also referred to in many histories of slavery as mastery. Nancy Thomas recalled that she was the special little girl for her Mistress Harriet's daughter, and that even during them days, she would sew and knit. Nancy, she said, would sit on a three-legged stool, so a very small three-legged stool, and she would sit between her young mistress's legs while she would sew and knit. And if I'd done something wrong, she said, she'd pinch my ear a little and say, "Oh, you dropped the stitch, Nanny." As Nancy Thomas's testimony shows, Polonia Smith, who was her young mistress, was a mistress in the making, a slave owner in the making, responsible for overseeing the production of the enslaved girl she would come to own and discipline her when it did not meet her requirements. And so, yet again, when we talk about formerly enslaved people, when we listen to what formerly enslaved people have to say, we come across accounts like Lit Young's. So Lit Young was owned by a woman named Martha Gibbs. And Martha Gibbs was this really spunky, twice-widowed white woman who was Irish and would outcuss any man, according to Lit. And not only that, but she hired an overseer. So these are typically white men who would, manage the enslaved people who worked in the fields. So she hired an overseer to oversee her slaves. But then Martha wasn't quite sure that he was up to snuff. So Martha would oversee her overseer. Not only that, she constructed the housing for the enslaved people that she owned. She built a church for their worship. She hired a preacher so that, a mulatto preacher in particular, a yellow preacher as Lit called him, so that their souls would be looked after. And when the Civil War came, she knew the writing was on the wall. She knew that her investments in slavery would be dissolved with emancipation. So rather than risk that fate, She picked up her most valuable slaves and she moved them to Marshall, Texas, hundreds of miles away. She not only moved them to Marshall, Texas, but she hired a group of white Irishmen, he referred to them as Irishmen, to guard them overnight so that none of them would run away. And she kept them enslaved a year after the Emancipation Proclamation was enacted. So they were enslaved for an entire year after slavery was over. And she only set them free because the federal government came and said, this is not okay, you have to let them go. So she finally let them go, but only after they had made her first crop in Texas. So this is Lit Young's account of what had happened to him, what he had experienced, and also kind of this rich account of this woman's deep and profound investments, economic investments in the institution of slavery. And so it was people like Lit that led me to write this book. As I mentioned, they talk about the ways in which white women weren't simply these kind of wilting lilies that shied away from the violence and the horrors of slavery. These were women who had grown up in slavery. They had grown up in a culture of violence in which they understood that violence was fundamental to submission, fundamental to keeping African Americans in captivity. And so they were not afraid to implement acts of violence, to enact and perpetrate acts of violence against formerly enslaved people. This is a rendering from a book about, it's called The Picture of Slavery in the United States, but it shows a very kind of public, exposed instance of a woman perpetrating an act of violence against an enslaved girl or enslaved woman. And this was not uncommon. From what formerly enslaved people had to say, this was quite common when enslaved people would commit any infraction, even if it was simply burning the biscuits. They talked about white women who enacted violence against them. So this is a wonderful woman, Marion Kinchian Edwards, and what she talked about when she told her interviewer about her experience in slavery is that she was a wet nurse, and she served as her mistress's wet nurse, and that was the only labor that she had performed during slavery. And so what that said to me was that there's something more to this story here that may in fact be economic in its basis. So what I did was I said, well, how often, how frequent do formerly enslaved people talk about enslaved women serving as wet nurses? And so I combed through the testimony, the interviews that they did, and found that they talked about it far more frequently than many historians of Southern women and Southern motherhood accounted for. And the reason why I was able to to conclude that is in large part because I looked at how formerly enslaved people talked about the practice. So rather than simply looking for words like breastfeed and nursing, I looked specifically for I tried to understand how formerly enslaved people talked about the practice. And so I learned kind of the lexicon through which they talked about wet nursing. And by doing that, I found far more instances in which they talked about the labor that these women performed in this capacity. They talked about the severances and separations that were the consequence of women being taken from their children as a consequence of being forced to, compelled to perform this kind of labor. And not only that, but I said, well, where else could I find evidence to corroborate these women's accounts? And so that's when I went to Southern newspapers and found that throughout Southern newspapers, there were thousands of wanted ads seeking out enslaved people, enslaved women in particular, enslaved mothers in particular, to serve as wet nurses for white children. And here are some examples of some of those advertisements. So what you'll notice is that these advertisements aren't simply about hiring enslaved people, but specifically about purchasing enslaved women to serve in this capacity. And for those of you who know about the female body and about breastfeeding, it's supposed to be a temporary, kind of labor. We know mothers. I'm a mother. It is labor. I learned myself that it's labor, and it's not easy labor either. It takes physiological tolls on the body. And so it did the same in this context. So what these ads show is that when white women called upon enslaved women to serve in this capacity, they created such a demand that it created a niche sector of the slave market, which catered to white mothers seeking enslaved mothers to serve in this capacity. So thousands of these ads appear. Most of the ads reference slave hiring or hiring of enslaved mothers to serve in this capacity. But as you can see here, these ads reference the sale of these women for the purpose of nursing white infants. What's also really important, one of the things that I found that was really important about this market was that the individuals who sought out these individuals and who often proposed to sell them were often slave traders. So slave traders not only specialized in the variety of forms of labor that enslaved people performed, but this was also a very important form of labor that they sought to market as well. So the individual ad at the bottom, Capers and Hayward, they were a slave trading firm in South Carolina. And Alston Gordon, he was also a slave trader. So these are individuals who made their living buying and selling enslaved people, and they recognized enslaved mothers' kind of maternal labor as one that had a value outside of the household, outside of the intimate space of the nursery. So by listening to what women like Marion Edwards had to say, I was able to further corroborate, and then also discover this really extraordinary dimension of the slave market that catered to white mothers. So it was created by white mothers because of the demand that they created for these women. And then it was specifically providing enslaved women, enslaved mothers for these women and their children. And so during the Civil War, right after the Civil War, and literally a year after the Civil War, and then into the 1870s, what you have are hundreds and thousands of formerly enslaved people seeking out the loved ones that they lost over the course of their lives. And so one of the ways that they do this is they place what are called lost friends ads, or information wanted ads in their local newspapers. And so what's really wonderful about Black communities in this period, but also it's up to the present, is that the church became like the central place where people reconnected. So on Sundays during the service, the pastors would read these advertisements aloud, hoping that the individual who placed them would, for whatever reason, hopefully someone in the congregation would know who this person was, would help to reconnect those individuals. And so here what you see is one of those information wanted ads or lost friends ads. And so Carolyn Mason is talking about the people that she lost. She's seeking out individuals that she lost. But what she also makes clear is who was responsible for the severances that basically made those individuals from their loved ones. So here you can see very clearly, she's saying, my family member was owned by this woman and was sold by her. And that's really important because she's not saying, she sold, she owned me, but someone else she owned this person, but someone else sold this person. She's not only identifying her as the legal title holder, but she's also saying she was responsible for this separation in the first place. I got my slides all willy-wally over here, so I'm just double checking. And see here again, you see William May's Lost Friends advertisement. And it highlights several things about white slave-owning women. So he talks about their business practices, their families. So what he says is, this guy, Jack Sampson, stole his grandmother from her legal owner, who was a woman, Tella Lee Stokes. So he's not only identifying a female owner, He makes it clear that there are these conflicts within white families over women's property and property rights. And he also tells us that while Tellelise Stokes held legal title to him in that bottom yellow square, he was living with Jimson at the time, which is likely his way of telling us that he was hired to this Jimson person so that Tellelise Stokes could receive the wages that he earned for his work. So even though he's seeking out and trying to reconnect with and reconstitute family members that he lost, what he's also telling us is about the kind of chains of ownership, the ways in which white women, white families were ultimately responsible for the separations in the first place. And so it's these kinds of sources that I used to track down women, to kind of reconstruct the stories that formerly enslaved people told us about these women. And I want to also make sure this one is. And so here again, this guy Smith, describes a legal process, which you wouldn't think formerly enslaved people, although subjected to the law in some ways, that they would know about the law in the kind of proper formal ways that we think about the law, but they really did. So what Guy Smith describes in his Lost Friends ad is an estate division. So this is a description of how his family came to be separated through the divvying up, the division of a deceased white person's property. And so not only does he talk about an estate division, but then he tells us who his children went to during this estate division. And he uses terms like drawn and fell. So if you see drawn and fell, you might not think about an estate division, but when formerly enslaved people talked about being drawn or falling to someone, those terms often reflected these deep and profound and traumatic separations that were the consequence of estate divisions. So he talks about several women who received his children as part of their shares. And this is actually a legal document that reflects exactly what Guy Smith was talking about. This is a handwritten note or document, legal document, which not only shows that delineates or lists the enslaved people that were in that estate, but also which child received which portion. And it also shows the values of the enslaved people. So these legal documents, I said, okay, formerly enslaved people are talking about being drawn. They're talking about falling to a white person. So what do the legal documents say? And so you see that these legal documents bear out, corroborate what formerly enslaved people had to say about not simply these legal processes, but also about the ways in which white women, white girls, white young girls economically benefited from the institution of slavery, and how their identities became tied to either the promise of slave ownership or the actuality, the eventuation of that. And so this gentleman, James Skinner, he was a pastor, but he too left behind these kind of fragments of a story about the woman who owned him. And so I was super excited. I know you're gonna be like, what? I was super excited when I found these two Lost Friends ads for James Skinner. He's looking for his brother, who he left behind forcibly. He was compelled to leave, I should say it that way, because Angelica Chu, the woman who owned him, decided that she was going to take the enslaved people that she owned and flee to Mississippi. So James is not quite clear on how to spell Angelica's name. First, he spells it Angelico Chu. You see, and then he spells Frisbee with a P-H-R. In the second ad, because he still had not found his brother, he spells her name Angelo Chu. But I was like, I think he's on to something here. what should I do? What should I do? So I started to put in these variations of her name. I knew that this was a woman, so I put in variations. And so Angelica Chu kept coming up. And it kept coming up in Yazoo County, Mississippi. It kept coming up in Washington, D.C. It was connected to these other women in Washington, D.C. So there was a lot of stuff going on in Washington, D.C. around Angelica Chu. And so I said, well, what if I just use these fragments of his Lost Friends ad to try to find Angelica? And so I started to find little details that, again, corroborated James's account. So here, I found her husband's obituary. And in the obituary, you can see that some of those details that James provided in his Lost Friends ad appear here. So Yazoo County, Mississippi is identified as Frisbee's residence. His wife was with him. He had children. He left and he went to Washington, D.C. because he was appointed to a governmental position. So that would explain why they would have a connection between D.C. and Yazoo County, Mississippi. He died early, so she's a widow, but she's very young. I found that she was very young when she was widowed. But nevertheless, it helps to kind of retrace the steps that James describes in his Lost Friends ads. So then I got even luckier. So this is why I'm excited, because I feel like I'm a forensic scientist. I'm in the archives. I'm looking and I'm finding all these little details. So this is Angelica's father's will. I'm telling you. I mean, I'm the biggest nerd because when I find these things, I'm so overwhelmed and excited because I say, see, he told us. So here is George Washington Biscoe, Angelica Chu's father's will. And in that yellow box, some really interesting, fascinating tidbits. And this is something that I constantly saw as I wrote the book and as I researched the book. So this guy, he's saying about his daughter, he says that he already gave Angelica her share of his slaves. So before he died, he had already given Angelica her share of the estate. This went a long way. This goes a long way to explaining why some women don't show up in wills. So he was really exceptional in this case because he's telling us what happened. But many wills don't do this. Many of these patriarchs and matriarchs' wills don't account for property already given away. And so what you see here is he says, Angelica, you already got your stuff. So don't ask for anything else, Make it clear that if there are any kind of conflicts that emerge over the will later on, because people did fight, families still fight and fuss over a deceased loved one's property, that everybody knows where they stand. So he said, I already gave you your stuff, so you already have your stuff. But I'm going to make sure that your sister gets an equal share. So that's what he says here. And then he also says a really important thing, and it's underlined. And he says, the property that I give to you, my youngest daughter, is for your sole and separate use. Now, this might seem like just fancy language, but it was legal language, critically important legal language that you see emerge in a number of legal records, which accorded white women who owned slaves property but control over that property that their husbands could not touch, that their husbands could not sell to pay off their debts, that their husbands could not dispose of in any way. And if they did overstep those boundaries, these women could take those men to court and sue those men, sue their husbands for overstepping the boundaries that they deemed inviolable. And so what you frequently see is this kind of clause, a very important legal clause in the wills that these white folks left behind, where they bequeathed property to their daughters. You also see it in prenups. So these women would often be able to protect any property that they received before they got married with documents that very much resemble the prenups that we hear about today. I don't have enough to have a prenup, but if I did, I might think about it. And so what I also found was this really fascinating document. So again, when James Skinner talked about being kind of what they refer to as refugeed away from everyone he knew and loved, well, not everyone, but at least his brother that he clearly had a very close and intimate relationship with, he talked about being compelled to leave Washington, D.C. and move to Mississippi. And here, this document, it actually reflects his residence in Washington, D.C. On April 16th, just yesterday, 157 years just yesterday, Washington, D.C. Congress enacted the D.C. Emancipation Act, which essentially provided compensation to slave owners who lived in Washington, D.C. if they would willingly acknowledge and recognize the abolition of slavery in the district, and they would have to apply for compensation. So again, using just those small fragments of information that James left behind in those ads, I was able to find Angelica Chu's application for compensation. And in the ad, in that little yellow box at the bottom, those are some of James Skinner's family members, including him. He's listed there. And on the frontispiece piece or the verso of the petition or application for compensation, Angelica is listed not just by herself, but also with her mother and her sister, who are also listed in the will. So by listening to what formerly enslaved people had to say, by not being as kind of constrained in my vision, my perspective, my approach to the sources, by being a little bit more open-minded and being willing to work a little more to dig a little deeper, I was able to kind of reconstruct this kind of really vivid picture of what was happening to James and his family members. And another really striking way that I found women was through the census. So before 1850, in 1840, the census basically, it kind of was structured in the way that the patriarchal household is structured. So it listed a male household member, a male patriarch, and then it just kind of put ticks down a list of family members who were female and of certain age groups, male of certain age groups. So it only identified the male patriarch, the male household member, a male household, male head of household by name. So it made it impossible to figure out whether any women in that particular household may have owned property or owned slaves in particular. But in 1850, that changed, because in 1850, the government said, hey, we've got all these enslaved people living in the country. We might want to know just how many there are. So they created a slave schedule, which identified owners of particular enslaved people, and then enumerated their slave holdings. So unfortunately for historians of slavery like myself, they don't identify the enslaved people by name, so that makes it very difficult for us to trace our ancestors, enslaved ancestors prior to 1870. But nevertheless, they identify the owners of enslaved people in their respective households. And here's an example of a page that identifies a slave-owning woman, Sarah Rhodes. And so what it also shows is that she owned a significant number of enslaved people. All of these are the enslaved people that she owned by age, by color. And so this is a really extraordinary, was extraordinary find for me because it was right there. And so what I've been doing is Mary, in her introduction, mentioned the numbers, the percentages, the potential percentages of enslaved, of women who own slaves. And so what I've been doing with a team of undergraduates and graduate students is going through the 1850 and 1860 censuses to determine just how many women are listed there as slave owners, identified as slave owners, and then enumerating their slave holdings, and trying to get a sense of this information in rural areas as well as in urban areas. So that's something that I'm currently doing. And so from the kind of preliminary work that I've done, the numbers are around 38 to 40%, depending on the region and the area. And what you see here is the way that the law, that state legislators recognized women as slave owners. So again, it's right there. We just have to look for it. So here is an excerpt from a statute from from Missouri, sorry about that. And you can see how they constantly reference the mistress. They constantly reference belonging to him or her. They constantly reference her own. Her property, her plantation. So it's not simply that these women are standing in their husband's stead or acting as deputy husbands, as some have referred to them. These are women who the courts, who the law recognize as owners of slaves in their own right, and it's right in the laws. And so when slave owning women needed money, they often hired out enslaved people that they didn't need to work in their households. And so this is actually a receipt that was given to a woman, Eliza Farrell, who hired out an enslaved woman named Rhodes to work on the public works. So this is a receipt for the wages that she received. So city officials, again, are recognizing that these women are economically invested in the institution. And so this is a very funky looking document, I'm sure, for you guys. But what it shows is a page from what was called a census of merchants. So this is very unique it seems very unique to New Orleans. They have all of these independent, very small scale merchants who required licensure in order to ply their trade in the city. And so they wanted to know who needed a license and who had to pay the fee for the license. And so they went throughout the city and they tried to find as many of these individuals as they possibly could so they'd get their money. So this is actually an excerpt out of a kind of extract from the census, which shows that there were female merchants who were working nearly a couple of doors away from slave traders, male slave traders. So what you see at the first arrow is Madam Harriet, who had an oyster stand, an oyster restaurant, and she was just a few blocks over, or if not, just a few doors away from a slave trader, C.F. Hatcher. Another slave trader, David Wise. So it shows how the kind of spatial configuration of the South was really the spatial configuration of southern cities made it nearly impossible for women to avoid the kind of the economic dimensions of the slave trade, the slave market, and they could also provide services and receive compensation. Even if they didn't own enslaved people, they could benefit economically by providing services and goods to the men and some women who plied the trade. And what this shows is a city jailer who, there was an enslaved man who ran away, and the city jailer is basically saying, hey lady, this enslaved man says he belongs to you. If this is true, you need to come here, you need to show us the documentation to support your ownership, and if you can prove your ownership, you can take him home. So again, there's a way in which publicly, both public officials, city officials, state legislators are recognizing, even federal government employees are recognizing the vitality of women's as slave owners, the ways in which they benefit from the institution as owners of enslaved people. Here is a page out of a slave trader's account book. So after he purchased enslaved people, John White would record those transactions, record how much he bought them for, and almost also how much he sold them for. And here you can see that he sold enslaved people to this one woman, Mrs. Johnson, several times. which is really, I think, fascinating. And you can see the markup, which is also really interesting. And this is a bill of sale, so it's handwritten. So again, there are these kind of formal ways in which these archives document white women's economic investments in the institution, but this is something that would pass between neighbors, for example, or individuals in their own communities, and maybe later on find its way to the courts, find its way to a local clerk, so that the clerk could officially validate the sale. So these are ways in which even at the kind of very local communal level, women are economically invested in the institution. And here's another bill of sale, which is, I really think is fascinating because it's pre-printed. So it means that there's somebody else, there's somebody printing these bills of sale up, they're benefiting from the sale of these documents, but this also shows, it documents a slave trader's sale, purchase actually, of an enslaved woman from a white woman. And again, I'm gonna slide right through all these. So here, she's identifying this servant girl as her own, my servant girl. And this one is really fascinating because it shows that there are two women who own this enslaved person before the person who's placing the ad owned them. So Mrs. Clark and Mrs. Toogood. And so even in during the Civil War, this is months before the Civil War is over, she is still deeply invested in this enslaved man. She wants him back. She is asking people for help in reclaiming him. And so it's really, I think, key to the account is really important because it shows that up to the very end, white women who owned enslaved people were deeply invested in the preservation of slavery. They were willing to fight for its preservation and for its perpetuation. And they were there all along. This book shows that if we listen to what formerly enslaved people had to say about these women, about their economic investments in the institution, we will find a very complex and a richer conceptualization of slavery where women are there all along. We just need to pay a little closer attention. See all the women in there? So on that note, I will end, and hopefully you have some questions for me. And thank you so much for listening to me today and being here.
Here, receipts, bills of sale, inheritance documents, things that show up in legal records to record the legalization of intergenerational transfer. All of the runaway notices, all of the lost friends ads that you looked at. This is such an impressive demonstration of the importance of what's called unconscious documentation. That is, people are documenting, now that we read these things, in a way that they didn't realize they were revealing aspects of gender relations, aspects of property relations, aspects of quantified figures. I mean, you're very adept at handling the material, especially the importance of what might be casually passed over by uninitiated historians. So I think you deserve a round of applause just by getting the documentation out there. And then your skill on top of that, in terms of weaving the personal narrative through it, how you can trace the multiple sale of a particular slave through different owners and the like. This is really quite extraordinary and inspiring to professional historians who, I would think, after reading this book, would want to go back and look at their own notes in a new way. So I'm impressed on so many levels and wish to ask some questions to relate it to the one or two things that others might know about either issues of slavery itself, of which obviously the transatlantic slave trade is the dominant feature, but there were forms of slavery here, especially in New England, that emerged prior to the transatlantic slave trade. We're just beginning to figure out the sort of Indian slave trade in that respect, and how it was eclipsed later by the presence of African populations. And then after the slave-owning period, after the slavery itself was abolished, the Emancipation Proclamation, just 2 nights ago in this very same venue, we had Professor Henry Louis Gates Jr. talking about the Reconstruction period and then the destruction of the Reconstruction period, largely with the help of, and in many cases the instigation of, white Southern women through the UDC. And its implications for several things, including education. But the United Daughters of the Confederacy basically emerge as a way of retelling Reconstruction history. And they write it in stone, as he says, that they put up monuments one after another. So I'm curious, in both directions, how would you place this whole experience of women, white ownership of slaves in the larger context of pre-African American slavery, or if we call it not pre, at least other areas of the country where other slavery was prominent, like the Indian slavery in the Northeast, and then afterwards too. Is there any follow-on from your own work, for example, to the post-Reconstruction role of white women in reinventing the narrative of the slave-owning past?
Absolutely. So the book ends with Reconstruction, but it also talks about the ways in which white women who owned enslaved people, they kind of reimagine, they kind of sanitize, okay, thank you. They sanitize their economic investments in the institution after slavery is over in these kind of very nostalgic, lost cause autobiographies, I guess you could say. And what's really interesting is that in the beginning, in the dedications, they make it very clear that they have an audience in mind when they write them. They talk about, they dedicate them to their children, their children's children, and their children's children's children. So they have their descendants specifically in mind in many cases. And in their prefaces, they talk about the ways in which they're writing this so that their children's children will know what it was like for them as young women. And in those accounts, they sanitize their economic investments in slavery disappear. They talk about how slavery was a positive and good institution that taught enslaved people how to be civilized, how to be good Christians, and how their roles were simply as kind of maternal figures who cared for these dependents in the ways that they cared for their children. So there's a way in which white slave-owning women after slavery is over kind of construct these narratives that I think coincide with the monuments that emerge. They're telling a very sanitized version of slavery that erases the trauma, erases the horrors that you can see, those separations, the trauma of those separations that formerly enslaved people talked about. But of course, formerly enslaved people are often telling a very different story at the same time. They're constructing a counter-narrative. The other thing that's really important is that there were women, the women that are in this book are not the most elite women. So I want to kind of dispel that myth. So the women that are in this book often owned 1 or 2 slaves, at the most 10 slaves. So these are the overwhelming majority of slave owners in the South who owned 10 or less, 10 slaves, 10 enslaved people or less. But there were a group of very elite slave-owning women who owned sometimes in the double digits, enslaved people in the double digits, like Martha Washington, but also had over $20,000 in property after, after the war. And those women, their property was often confiscated by the government. And so in order to get that property back, they would have to apply for amnesty in order to get that property back. And so they would petition, they would write these letters to Andrew Johnson. This is after Lincoln was assassinated, and tell these stories about how the losses of their slaves impacted them. So they don't have to do this. They simply have to fill out a form and send it in. But they take time to write these letters about how the government robbed them of this immense wealth, and that they're really sour about it. So there's this way in which they're constructing narratives that in one moment, when it's away from the public eye, when it's away from the eye of their descendants, tell a very vivid picture of their economic investments. But after slavery is over and after the writing is clearly dry on the wall, they're removing those economic elements of the narrative and telling a very sanitized account, offering a very sanitized account that positions them as positive influences.
I mean, I think it's an understatement to say it's sanitized. It's clearly propagandized in a way.
Absolutely.
Because as Professor Gates points out in his important documentary, quoting someone who encapsulated it very well, he says, "He who owns the past owns the future." So the recapturing of the narrative of the past is crucial. And these women from the UDC, United Daughters of the Confederacy, are in there in the 1890s. They founded in 1894, 30 years after the end of the war, and they start with one chapter. 10 years later, there are 30,000 members of the UDC rewriting the textbooks of Southern state history. Mm-hmm. Anyway, it's a very fascinating link, and you probably know the other scholars working in that area after yours, but you've provided an extraordinary launch point for them to get going on this.
Thank you very much. Karen Cox, I think, her work is really wonderful around the UDC and this the movement to kind of memorialize the Confederate cause.
Right.
Her work is really extraordinary around this subject as well.
Yes, and David Blight actually talks about it being written in stone because it was in the cemeteries.
Absolutely.
It was these stone statues, which are being toppled at this point for very obvious reasons. But it's really an extraordinary chapter that is made possible now from what we understand from your book. Thank you so much.
First, Professor, I want to applaud and salute you for the courage and just the vigilance in bringing to light such an extraordinary chapter that has been glossed over by everybody.
Thank you.
And so, I just want to salute you, sister. Brilliant job. I applaud you for that. In fact, I was in Harvard Bookstore, and I got the book on one evening, and then I teach a class here at the college for high school students called the W.E.B. Du Bois Society, and every Saturday we do Black History with these kids. And I went and bought 10 copies, and I gave it to all the young people, and I said, now look, this will get you in the proper direction around the real story, because she has uncovered some stuff that has been part of a fiction left, right, and center. And so I just want to applaud you. Extraordinary work. I know you're from Newark, New Jersey, right? You're from Newark,
from Newark, New Jersey.
Right? I'm from Philly, so there was some solidarity, right? Question, what now, in view of your excellent work, is the next stage of sort of developing a whole new historiographic frame? We were together when Skip did his thing Monday night, and Skip has gone deep and harder than I've known Skip since 1973, And this is the hardest I've ever seen Skip Gates go on anything. And this was, it's epic. And so where do we go from here, as they say, in terms of the groundwork that you've laid, the fact that, and it's one of the dimensions, the fact that you've been able to put a flashlight on the singular and unique experience of the African in America. And when I was listening to you and reading the book, I was thinking of Gene Genovese, because he argued many years ago, he said, listen, the black experience is unique in this country without analog. A lot of folk will dive in, now that the dust has settled, but this, and this is becoming increasingly clear in the national dialogue. Where do we go from here with the extraordinary work that you've done? And again, salute you, brilliant job, thank you.
My own work is I'm working on what I call a legal prequel to this book, which because the law was very fundamental to the book, but I wanted to focus on the economic dimensions of this history, the economic history here. But the law undergirds that. So I'm working on what I call a legal prequel sequel to the book, which helps to understand the really complex ways and the really extraordinary ways that women not only navigate and circumvent the constraints that the law imposed upon them as married women, but also the ways in which they mobilize the law to secure a certain kind of freedom through slavery, through slave ownership. So I'm working on the legal dimension of that. But I think that there are broader implications. For this book has broader implications for our society, for what has happened after slavery. It helps us to understand kind of really what happens in the civil rights movement around anti-integrationist activism. White mothers are at the forefront of that, both in the South, but also in the North, in places like Boston. I don't want to say it, in Beantown. There are pictures showing white mothers kind of, forcefully making the point that they don't want their children to go to school with black children. You see women even before that. They're part of the lynching rituals. They're part of these kind of acts of racial terror in the South. Why is that? It's been puzzling. It's been kind of befuddling, for us for so long. When you look at how deeply invested white women were in this system of white supremacy, because it was founded on black inferiority and white superiority, when you realize that they were deeply invested in this system of white supremacy, this element of white supremacy, then other things make a lot more sense. And so for me, it's kind of like the kind of historical context with which we can understand more deeply and in a more complex way these kind of moments of our history in which white women shock us, because we're assuming that their oppression as women, their gender oppression, will allow for them to kind of set aside the benefits of white supremacy and white privilege and embrace alliances across the color line. And when we don't see that happening, it's really perplexing. But I think this book really shows us and tells us why that might not happen when we expect it to.
Thank you again. This is very fascinating, and I'm deeply intrigued by this whole notion of the wet nurse and this trade in the wet nurse, and in even using a slave as a wet nurse because of the issue of white supremacy and, African descent, slave inferiority, and giving your white baby to a slave to nurse just seems so contrary to that. So I'm wondering if you can comment a little more on that. And then I'm also very, sad or wanting to know about what happens to the black babies of the slave, that now she can't nurse her own children. So if you can just comment a little more on that, because I find that so interesting. Anyway.
Thank you so much for that question. It's a wonderful question. So, what's really fascinating is I expected to see it a little bit, but when I saw it really frequently, quite frequently, the references to the use of enslaved mothers in this capacity, compelling them to serve as wet nurses for white children, I was perplexed about that very issue. And so particularly because in this moment, you have all of these fears and anxieties around white immigration from places like Ireland, for example, where you have immigrants that are serving in the similar capacity in the North. And so you have all of these kind of pseudoscientific tracts and pamphlets that are coming out, and advice literature that's coming out to white mothers who were born in the United States saying, you should not be giving your children to these women because they will imbibe the essence of these women through the breast milk. So I'm saying to myself, okay, you guys are worried about native-born white children imbibing the immoral essences, the allegedly immoral essences of Irish women who are coming here and serving as their wet nurses. But there are women in the South white women in the South who are giving their children, native-born children, to enslaved women who you deem as racially inferior. So how are you working through that? And so what's really fascinating, again, is that formerly enslaved people tell us all about that. So there are instances in which formerly enslaved people say, well, white couples realize that, okay, they don't have a problem with a black woman wet nursing their child if the black woman is free. So they would legally free an enslaved woman in order to serve as their child's wet nurse. So there are instances of that. There are instances in which these couples said, well, you know what, we don't want our child to suckle at the breast of an enslaved woman who's gonna go back to the quarters. So we're gonna literally construct a house so that she could be close to us and away from the enslaved community so that she could serve in this capacity. So saying that to say, those are just two examples of the ways in which white couples and white mothers in particular kind of grappled with that issue, that contradiction, that kind of paradox. And so they worked it out in these variety of ways. But ultimately, when they didn't work it out in these creative ways, they came down to, we prioritize the health of our white infant over all else. And that leads to the second question that you asked, because what ends up happening is that many of these enslaved mothers are separated from their children, not only sometimes forever, because they're sold away from their children to serve in this capacity, but most times temporarily. But we know now so much more about the bond between mother and child, and that at these very early moments, these very early stages in development, it's critical for an infant to receive its mother's breast milk because of the nutrients that come from that. So what's often happening is that when these women are taken away from their children are either put at the breast of another enslaved woman or put on a bottle. And so while today it's quite sanitary and quite popular for mothers to give their children bottles, in this period, pediatricians or doctors that would produce this advice literature would tell women that this is so dangerous because of sanitation, and it should be used as a last resort. So they're putting the lives of enslaved infants in danger in a variety of ways, but prioritizing the health and well-being of white infants, unfortunately.
I'm interested in the narratives of the women slave owners, not in the 1870s, but 30 years earlier. Mm-hmm. How did we all most of us like to think we're nice people, and we have narratives of our own behavior that tell us that we're nice. How did these women justify the pain and the tears and the separation that they must have seen?
That's a great question as well. So they talked about the fact that enslaved people, that African descended people, didn't feel the same way that white folks felt. That they did not, that they were not the same kind of sentient beings, that they were not the same kind of emotional creatures, emotional beings as white folks were. And they weren't making this up. This was language that we can see even in the slave trade during when Britain was just trying to figure out whether they wanted to abolish the slave trade. They held they had these interviews. So there were individuals who came to testify before them, and they would often ask them, well, did they they seemed bothered when they were separated from their families and sold off to the New World. And these individuals who were employed in the slave trade would say, oh no, they clearly didn't feel anything. Actually they were quite happy. They actually argued that African captives were happy to leave and go to the New World, and that they didn't mind being separated from their families and their loved ones and even their homelands. So this is very old language, and women often justified these separations by saying that these enslaved mothers didn't feel the same way about their children as we feel about our children. So they would often excuse it away by saying that African Americans weren't as emotionally connected to their children and their loved ones more broadly. So that's how they justified it.
I was just rereading Huckleberry Finn, and Jim was owned by a white woman of fairly modest means, I think, right? Yeah. But my question is rhetorical about the rhetoric in the book, And I'm reading it, and the N word is used a lot,
In Huckleberry Finn or in my book?
In Huckleberry Finn.
Oh, okay.
No, I mean, I don't know if you use it or not. I'm not sure if you do, but if you know what I mean. And I brought it to work one day, and my coworker said, young black children in school don't want to read that, even though, it's a great book, and Mark Twain, I consider him, I think he was an abolitionist in his own way. I don't know how you feel. But because the word is in there a lot, black children or even, maybe older people or even white kids don't want to read it, because of that word. Mm-hmm. And it kind of offends me a little bit, but that's Mark Twain put it in there because it was the vernacular, I guess. But do you think that the book should be in the schools to read, or should it be sanitized? Not sanitized, but should that word be changed, or what? What do you think about that?
Well, I will answer your question by taking it back to the decisions that I made around that same issue of whether to include derogatory language, particularly the N-word, in the book, and why I made the decisions I did. So I think that will reflect upon, will help to address your question. So formerly enslaved people frequently use the N-word in their testimony, in their interviews, when they refer to themselves and when they're recounting what their former owners had to say, and also when they talk about other formerly enslaved people in their communities during slavery. And so I felt like I wanted to do justice to the accounts, the testimony that they offered, in the context that they offered it, because these individuals were often talking to the descendants of former slave owners. They were frequently white Southerners, and this was a racially hostile context in which to provide these interviews. And so they were very candid in many respects. We wouldn't think that they would be, but they were very candid. And so for me, I wanted to do justice to the stories that they chose to tell in the ways that they chose to tell them. And so for me, that's one of the reasons why I left the N-word in the excerpts that I quoted from their accounts. Fiction, I think, might be a little bit different. We can't go back and tell Mark Twain that it's not cool and to take it out. We are at a point where we can't do that. But I think that if teachers choose to keep it in the classroom, if teachers choose to teach it, that they can also use it as a teachable moment in which to talk about the violence of those terms, the violence of those derogatory words, the history of those words, how they impact Black communities, and where we go from there.
So not change the word. Maybe not change the word, possibly. Yeah.
Because again, it's like when I say, if somebody says go F yourself.
Yeah, right.
I'm not condoning the use of the term. I don't want that to be what's coming across here. But what I think is that when we take it out, we are not facing head on the violence and the violence of terms and terminology and words and the ways in which it shapes profoundly the experiences of African Americans in the country. And so while I think it's problematic because it's a fictional account, I think centering it and using it as a teachable moment, as a way in which to engage in a conversation around racial discrimination and labels and all of that. I mean, we see it even today with terms like animals and infestation and so forth, that we can use it to talk about these broader ways that language hurts and language wounds, you know?
Well, and your own work, I think, stands as a monument to the sensitive use of words and the way you drew out the term drawn, for example. You pause and you say, this used to mean. And in effect, what you're doing is what every historian wants to do, is to contextualize the use of language so that we realize what we're doing offhandedly and unconsciously can be offensive.
Yeah.
And this is extraordinary use of words in your own work, so it's a tribute.
Thank you.
To
So I
what
think
you've done.
I think it's responsible for us to keep them in, but also to teach our young people about, teach our children about the violence and importance of those words.
Thanks again for coming and joining us.